started right now. So I'm turning it over to you, Terry.
Thank you. Good morning. So if we could have a slide. This webinar is all about the TPEs. This is one piece of a many-piece technical assistance set of activities we'll be doing. And we'll have an agenda item at the September Commission meeting identifying a lot of those activities. We're very excited to be able to share this information with you. This whole effort on improving teacher preparation has to do with the fact that the Commission has told us, let's look at outcomes and let's look less at the inputs. And so the standards are very different than they have been in the past, as you know. And this session is all about the TPEs in depth. And so we're going to go through it. Amy Rising is going to do a key part of the session, and Katie Croy, who's our consultant for multiple single subject programs, will also be adding in information. So slide, please. Next slide, please. That was 2. Thank you. Okay, so the teaching performance expectations. I think we all know this, but we're just going to make sure everyone's on the same page. They define the knowledge and skills that a beginning teacher must have at the day they're recommended for their credential. And even more important than that, many of these TPEs will be assessed on the teaching performance assessment, and all of them need to be assessed by the program. And so we're going to have Amy take us through what are the key changes, and we're going to go through the TPEs. So next slide, and Amy.
So good morning, everyone. As you know, we've had teaching performance expectations in California that have been guiding programs and the current approved TPAs, but we are at a point of great change. And so along with program changes, we needed, after about 12 years, 15 years, we needed to update our teaching performance expectations. So there are some very key changes in the performance expectations that are now required, and we wanted to make sure that we touched on those before we jumped into the actual text. So for those of you who have looked at them, and for those of you who are going to look at them, you will notice that there's an increased focus on teaching students with disabilities. There's an increased focus on use of technology in teaching, educational technology, a focus on supporting English learners, of course, through ELD, ELA lens, and the work that the Department of Ed has done on the new framework, integrating the visual arts across all content areas, updating approaches to classroom management, increasing a focus on developing students' critical, creative, and analytic thinking, getting kids ready for college and career, a new focus, perhaps, or a refocus on socio-emotional learning, and then also the notion of restorative justice practices. So all of these concepts are now sort of front and center in the new set of TPEs. Next slide. So the structure of the TPEs, again, those of you who have looked at it, it's a fairly lengthy document. It has 2 sections. The first section is about, includes the 6 TPEs that are aligned to the CSTP. And there's 6 to 8 elements under each TPE. And each TPE, each of the 6 TPEs has a narrative that illuminates what the elements are stating. Next slide, please. So Terry, you want to take this one, or you want me to keep going?
Certainly, sorry. So there's a second section of the TPEs that's essential also for everyone to be looking at, and it has 3 components to it. Some of this information used to be in program standards, such as the program standard on teaching English learners in the past, but it's in the TPEs now. It's going to talk about these 3 areas of developmentally appropriate teaching English learners and subject-specific pedagogy. This is great information for candidates. It really provides a lot more detail related to grade level, the content area, and the students. And so this information is also needs to be assessed by the program and on the TPA.
Next slide. One of the most important aspects of this document, of course, is that we use the word students often, and we wanted to be very clear. All the different groups that have worked on getting to this final revised form that was adopted by the Commission in June of 2016, we wanted to be very clear about what we meant when we said all students. So this paragraph that you see on your screen here on slide 8 sits in the front of the document and basically states that for all of the TPEs, as we reference students, we're talking about PK through 12 students, and that the intent is to be widely inclusive, and that it references all students attending public schools. Students may exhibit a wide range of learning and behavioral characteristics as well as disabilities, including dyslexia, intellectual or academic advancement, and have differences based on ethnicity, race, socioeconomic status, gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, language, religion, and/or geographic origin. The range in California public schools also includes students whose first language is English, English learners, and standard English learners. And the definition of all students is an inclusive definition that applies whenever and wherever the phrase is used in the document. So instead of repeating this intent to be fully inclusive, we just put it up in the beginning paragraph. But it's a very important paragraph and one that should really be focused on in teacher prep programs and will be emphasized in all materials relating to the TPA. Next slide, please. So this brings us to our first TPE, which is engaging and supporting all students in learning. So our intent is to kind of walk through the elements with you and point out some of the key features in each element. So beginning teachers, this element actually has, or this TPE actually has 8 elements. So beginning teachers apply knowledge of students and engage them in learning. They maintain ongoing communication with students and families and communicate achievement expectations and student progress. That's a very important element in that we really want to be able to prepare our new teachers to really reach out to students and families and be able to explain academic improvement. Connect subject matter to real life context. Use a variety of developmentally and ability appropriate instructional strategies, resources, and assistive technology to support access to the curriculum for a wide range of learners. So here, what we're pointing out in this element is that while students need to be in the most in the general ed classroom, even if they have learning needs, we want to be sure that our new teachers are able to understand different developmental levels and be able to design instruction that can meet their needs, including the use of assistive technology, so that all students can learn in the least restrictive environment. Next slide. Next, on this slide, you see elements 5 through 8. So element 5, under engaging and supporting our students in learning, is pointing out that we need to promote students' critical and creative thinking and analysis. So how is it that students are given the opportunities to think during instruction and apply that thinking to their learning? 6 talks about providing a supportive learning environment for students first and or second language acquisition and demonstrating an understanding of the difference among students whose only instructional need is to acquire standard English proficiency, students who may have an identified disability affecting their ability to acquire standard English proficiency, and students who may have both a need to acquire standard English proficiency and an identified disability. So the intent here was to be sure that our candidates are aware of all the different types of assessments that would need to occur to identify a student who might have English learning needs or who might have specialized learning needs or is a student who has both. But not to make assumptions that if you are an English learner, then you have some kind of specialized learning need. So we want to be very sensitive to the fact that we're not misidentifying students and that we're very careful to understand what that student's particular support is, whether it's a language support or whether it's a support for an identified learning need or whether it's a support for both. Element 7 talks about providing students with opportunities to access the curriculum by incorporating visual and performing arts. This is a new area that's come back into our public language and standards about making sure that we have multiple modalities for students to represent their knowledge using the arts. And then element 8 on this standard speaks to monitoring student learning and adjusting instruction while teaching so that students continue to be actively engaged in learning. So here we want to make sure not only can our candidates design instruction and provide instruction, but be able in the middle of instruction to change direction if that's what the students need to be able to keep them engaged in learning. So the whole notion of being able to be flexible and differentiate your instruction to meet the needs of all the students in your classroom. So next slide.
And this is where Katie Croy is going to come in and give us some information. Katie.
Good morning, everyone. I need TPE 2. Slide, please.
Slide 11 is up and going, ready to go, Katie. Go ahead.
All right, it's not showing up on mine. I'll go ahead. In this TPE 2, when you're looking at effective environments for student learning, there have been some additions that you really need to consider. Each student is to be treated fairly and respectfully, and this has always been the case, and we've looked at it from a teacher perspective, but this is looking at it from the whole class perspective, plus each of the individual peers that are in the class. So the outcome and the overall goal for this TPE is that there's truly a caring community, and that this caring community can allow for interactions among students that allow all students to learn. And the environment within that classroom will promote those diverse and multiple perspectives, and not only promote them, but value all of the perspectives and all of the diversity in the classroom. And in this classroom, those students are able then to produce real work and have hands-on learning so that they're comfortable in that atmosphere so they can truly have an opportunity to learn. And again, the emphasis on all students. And it addresses safety in the broadest sense. It's very inclusive. It goes beyond just that classroom, I can learn the content, but also emotionally, no bullying. It's safe to learn in this classroom, provided the right for each of the students to be themselves, have their own learning supported in this environment, so it responds to the entire person, that physical, mental, intellectual, and emotional health that we all value. And we need to value this for every student to enable them to learn and to eliminate the bias. So this support is for that whole child, and you have to keep reminding yourself it's all learners and that all of them are capable of learning and able to learn. That overarching requirement is to ensure that the teacher prep, as you're thinking about preparing for how to work with your candidates to get them ready for the classroom, is to broaden that perspective from the cognitive to include the social and emotional learning for that entire whole child and for their education. So as you're looking at rewriting those programs to meet the TPEs, be sure to revise to these TPE requirements. Next slide, please. The focus of 4 is, again, to think of that broad perspective as we talked about, and goes beyond just the academic resources. So this one is focusing on the resources that candidates need to be aware of so that they can provide for their students anything that is needed for all of those students in their classroom that there may be trauma students, the medically fragile. They may not, the student isn't expected to know everything the candidate is not expected to know everything that the students will need, but they need to know how to access the resources. So that should be included in their training. who to ask. They need to be aware of the work as a team and be prepared to assist all students. And then they need to have really high expectations for all students. The disposition for the candidates should be that all students can learn, and they need to provide support so that this can occur. Now, new to the TPEs is this information on classroom management. This must be taught to the candidate, not just caught. I think sometimes in the past it was hoped that and anticipated that when the candidate went out to the classroom, that in their student teaching position, they would catch the classroom management. And sometimes they caught things not to do and had to figure out on their own. But whether the candidate is in charge of the full classroom during student teaching or not, they still need to have these skills so that when they get their own classroom, they can incorporate this information into their class. So keep in mind as you're planning that the TPE is not just teacher to student, but also student to student, and how to manage all of that. So it's more explicit than it was in the past.
So moving to TPE 3, next slide. Now we're really talking about understanding and organizing your subject matter. Can we go to slide 13? Okay, so on
slide 13, sometimes the slides take a couple seconds to load at some point.
Exciting to be on subject matter. So subject matter, understanding and organizing, demonstrating knowledge of the subject matter. In this case, one of the things that the commission is probably going to be looking for is, are you using the curriculum frameworks and the standards as textbooks? The curriculum frameworks define subject-specific pedagogy in California, and the assessment design standards specify that the TPA is going to assess subject-specific pedagogy. So this is an in-depth knowledge of the subject matter and the way to teach the subject matter. Continuing in element 2, which is very much tied back to the TPE we were just hearing about, knowing your students, understanding your students, seeing your students as individuals. Planning instruction, the first best instruction for all students in your class, that it's no longer acceptable to plan a lesson for, the average middle student in my class. You need to think about students as individuals and what you know about them in your planning. In the third element, it brings back things you heard about Amy talk about in TPE 1 about integrating visual and performing arts. It has to do with the frameworks. Again, visual and performing arts, we're not asking that calculus students do interpretive dance on calculus concepts. We are instead saying that every content area should use the visual and performing arts in the reasonable way to allow students to present their knowledge in avenues that are not just paper and pencil. So it's incorporate the visual and performing arts in your discipline in a way that makes sense. Great activities where we've got models of cells, and it's very much incorporating three-dimensional art along with science concepts. The fourth element here has to do with working with the other adults in the world, in the education world. So collaborate with them, consult with them, and help this allow the students to have multiple ways to represent, engage, learn, and demonstrate knowledge. So this is not a drill and kill approach. This is not any sort of scripted. This is as the teacher in the classroom, working with other educators in the school setting, the larger school community, really figure this out together of how do you get to every student and really spark that interest. So next slide. Continuing in TPE 3, your candidates need to understand about adapting subject matter curriculum. They need to understand that academic language is essential, that all students should be growing in their academic language. And this again goes back to what Amy talked about with the knowledge of all students. And this was really a dilemma because there were some people that really said they wanted to hear all categories called out all the time, but the decision was made that that very rich and deep definition would be at the preface to the TPE. So please make sure your candidates go back to that routinely to understand all students. In the area of resources, this goes beyond the topic of textbooks. Resources, including standards-aligned instructional materials, but the range of technology, and this is one of the first times this calls out assistive technology. And this is something we may have to work with some of our special education faculty to help us have all the knowledge and information, but it's the broadest approach to resources so that everyone has access to the curriculum. Element 7 is looking at the idea of digital literacy. This is an element that's most likely going to be assessed in the program through your coursework and not really assessed on a TPA. It doesn't make a lot of sense to do a performance assessment for the information in this element in many ways. It's digital citizenship. It's understanding all the responsibilities having to do with technology. And this goes hand in hand with element 8, which directly calls out international educational technology standards and says, teacher candidates need to be knowledgeable about these. And this is beyond using technology for the whiz-bang effect. It's using technology to really enhance student learning. How do we use technology in a really meaningful way to help students learn and grow? Next slide, and we're going to go back to Amy.
Okay, so TPE 4 is planning, instruction, and designing learning experiences for all students. TPE 4 has 8 elements. The first element focuses on making sure that our preliminary candidates know how to locate and apply information about students to inform both their long-term and short-term planning. So this is a very important aspect of 4 and is highly focused on in the new revised, redeveloped TPA. So this notion is, while you, of course, are accessing the student academic content standards and frameworks, and you're talking with your colleagues about what you might be teaching in 2nd grade, this actually means that you have to pay attention to and take into account what your students already have, what their strengths are, what they're bringing into the classroom, what their background knowledge is, what their aspirations are, what their learning needs are, what their language abilities are, so that you can prepare the most responsive instruction you can for that particular group of students. And we have to help our candidates learn how to access that information, how to access testing information, how to access information about the community so that they are really well prepared to design instruction that meets the needs of their students. The second element is about, again, understanding and applying knowledge of the range and characteristics of typical and atypical child development. So throughout this document, you can see how this notion of understanding development, student development, is really important, and that this would inform instructional planning and help you provide, again, education in the general ed classroom to all students in that least restrictive environment. Element 3 is about designing and implementing instruction and assessment that reflects the interconnectedness of academic content. So as we saw Common Core come along, as we saw California adopt those standards, as we stepped back and started thinking about the importance of integrating content when we're teaching it, this element really draws that to the forefront. We want to see integrated curriculum when it makes sense and when it's appropriate. In element 4, we're going to see and ask teachers to plan, design, implement, and monitor instruction, making effective use of instructional time, and providing access to curriculum, again, for all students. And removing barriers, relates back to this notion of bringing assistive technology into your classroom and access through a whole range of instructional strategies. So really focusing on understanding many different ways to introduce content and support academic and socio-emotional learning. So just to point out, these elements on the slides are not the complete text of this actual TPE. So under element 4, there are some key bullets about the appropriate use of instructional technology, including assistive tech, applying principles of universal design and multi-tiered systems of support. Both notions going back to again, this idea that all students are in a general ed setting, that should appropriately be there, and that they're supported in that general ed setting in that least restrictive environment. The use of developmentally, linguistically, and culturally appropriate learning activities and materials and resources for the full range of English learners, appropriate modifications for students with disabilities, opportunities for students to support each other in learning, and finally, the use of community resources and services. So element 4 is pretty broad. That moves us to element 5 under instructional planning, which is about promoting student success by providing opportunities for students to understand and advocate for strategies that meet individual learning needs. And again, we cite explicitly IEPs, individual educational plans, the IFSPs, which is really for the younger students, the ITP, the transition plan, which is about older students transitioning into college and career, and 504 plans for students who need accommodations, perhaps, and support, but are not on an IEP. So we want to be very supportive in making sure that our preliminary candidates are aware of the supports and the legal sort of supports that are in place for students who have needs in our schools, the whole full range of needs, and that they are aware of those particular plans and that they have access to them so they can use what's in those plans, in the IEPs, in the 504 plans. If a child is identified as GATE, that they understand that as they're doing instructional planning. Okay, that brings us to TPE 6, and the slides need to go back to TPE 4. So TPE 6 is about accessing resources for planning and instruction. And again, you know, I think really, to me, this speaks to making sure that our candidates understand that they're not alone in the classroom teaching, that they're surrounded by colleagues, resources at their school site, at their district, through their county offices, that they have resources in the community, and that they need to reach out and learn about those and pull those resources into their instructional planning. Element 7 is about planning instruction that promotes a range of communication strategies and activity modes between teachers and students and among students to encourage learning. So this speaks to really building those relationships between the teacher and the student, but also providing instructional strategies that allow students to work with each other in small groups, in larger groups, work with other grade levels, work outside the school, and to promote that full range of communication strategies. And that includes technology here. We have the World Wide Web now. We can have access to classes in Singapore and on the other side of the world. How are we using those resources and bringing that into the classroom to connect our students out as broadly as we can? And then finally, 8 speaks to this again, digital use of digital tools and learning technologies across the learning environment to be able to create new content and provide personalized and integrated technology-rich lessons. So, you know, making sure that you understand as a new teacher or a teacher in your school site what access you have, and making sure that you are not just using technology yourself to provide instruction, but really building your students' capacity to use technology and to become digitally literate and giving them multiple means to demonstrate their learning. So this is another notion that runs throughout all of these TPEs, and that's that students should be able to demonstrate their knowledge and understanding in multiple ways through multiple modalities. So that wraps up TPE 4. You can go to the next slide. Katie?
This is Katie. Sorry, I was on mute. On this slide, we're looking at on element 1. On element 1, we're looking at how The diagnostic, informal, formal progress monitoring can be formative, summative, and performance, so that scoring rubrics are used. And the TPA provides the scoring scoring criteria for this. And the teacher must have this capacity to know what they're measuring. They can't just be measuring something and not understand what they're measuring. They need to have a clear way to document this measurement, and then they need to be able to share it with the family and the students. The rubrics must be used. They don't have to necessarily write the rubric. It doesn't have to be something that they design for the classroom, but they must use scoring rubrics and understand those and understand how to prepare and use rubrics, at least, that are appropriate for the situation. In element 2,
Katie, could I interrupt here about element 1 for a minute? And Amy, you may have to help here also, but this element was one I think I heard the most concern about with faculty as we were talking, because of the specificity, because it does call out, it's not on the slide, but it does call out all the types of assessment: diagnostic, informal, formal, progress monitoring, formative, summative, performance assessment. And the goal here is that teachers have to be appropriate consumers of assessments, selecting the right ones and understanding how to use assessments and make use of the assessment for planning instruction. And this is a tough issue. We're asking a lot here. And so I think this is something that we really need to work with institutions so that they understand that this is a priority. And so it's going to take a bit for us all to get our heads around this, I think, the specificity in this. Amy, what else have you heard on this element?
Yes, I think that's right. I think what we're seeing here is the desire, again, amongst all those work groups of educators and the commission itself, that we need to really prepare our candidates in a deeper manner than perhaps we've been doing in the past around the issues of assessment and the types of assessment and the purpose for assessment. So I think the other thing you'll see in the redeveloped TPA is an emphasis on assessment and how it's developed, how it's implemented, how student work is analyzed, and how that analysis of student work then informs instructional planning. So I think in pre-service, it would be, something that I would hope that everyone is relooking at their syllabi and curriculum to make sure really that we're giving opportunities to our candidates to learn about that full range of assessments, be good consumers of assessments, to understand the basic properties, of the underlying principles of what is a reliable and valid assessment, and how to develop some of that work in your classroom. For example, progress monitoring or checking for understanding is assessment, should be going on almost all the time during instruction. So, I think you're right, Terry. I think this is a really important element that pushes a little bit on moving the whole point and understanding of assessment to the forefront in teacher prep.
Sorry for interrupting, Katie, but I just wanted to help really highlight that this is an important one for programs to think about.
Well, I appreciate the additional input. I agree that is a bit of a stretch perhaps for some programs to grasp this, so thank you for the clarification. In element 2, one of the key words here is multiple measures, and we are often asked, what does it mean when you say multiple measures? Well, in this case, it is definitely more than one, so that makes it multiple, but it should be also across the entire learning time, so it's not a one-shot assessment. The candidate is collecting and analyzing the information at multiple times, and they should take this information and allow it to inform their lesson plans and their modifications for their next steps in their instruction. In their TPAs, they will analyze their student work and determine those next steps, the pre-assessment, and then the progress monitoring, as Amy spoke of just a moment ago, and then move more into the formal assessment to check to see if those learning goals are really achieved. And how the candidate is understanding all of this before they even get into the classroom is key, so that they can truly use the assessment to inform their practice and how they are teaching in the classroom and how they are assessing in the classroom. It should be an overarching piece. So those multiple measures occur throughout the year and throughout the time that the candidate is teaching. In element 3, it involves all students and all individual students. It looks at their learning goals and their progress, but it's using the self-assessment piece. And I think one of the keys here, and I noticed this a lot when I was in a faculty position and observing candidates, is they were really great at planning these amazing lessons that were very detailed and lots of information put in every nook and cranny, but they didn't allow time for the students to revisit information or to redo their pieces of assessments where they had not been able to master the content. It was more of a, well, you failed that, let's go on. But this is asking and ensuring that the teacher plans for redos, not just a one-shot assessment, beyond a lesson plan, and including that in the lesson plan. So ensuring that the candidates understand that they need to have that component in their lesson plans and allow for redoing and revisiting information so that the student in the classroom actually is learning, not just walking through the steps of taking an assessment. And then on element 4, using technology. This is important in the classroom because even though, and I used to hear, well, there's not that much technology in the classroom where my candidate is going. Well, there needs to be technology in classrooms where you're placing these candidates, and they need to understand how to use technology in multiple ways to support assessment, both the administration of their assessment pieces and then their analysis. And then a key component is communicating then all of the outcomes with the students and the families in a timely and relevant manner. And this needs to be academically and socially. What are the outcomes of where the student is, and they need to inform families and students how they're doing academically and socially. Next slide. On element 5, using assessment information, this is part of what I just spoke about in the timely manner. This will help the student to understand where they're needing to continue to make improvement and to progress and how they're doing in their progress in meeting those learning goals that have been established. So it was mentioned earlier that the academic K-12 content standards needed to be a part of this process. And also, though, again, remember the social emotional growth. This isn't to replace academic growth. You still need the rigor of that academic progress, but you also need to focus on that social and emotional growth and balance it. And then element 6, work with specialists. You don't have to be, as a beginning teacher, an expert in every area, but you do have to know where to go to get the information that you need and to be able to look at each individual student and be able to distinguish what their needs are. And in this case, a student might be identified as, let's say, learning disabled, but when you really look at it, they may be an EL learner, and the candidate needs to be able to distinguish between the two. Do they have a disability? Are they an EL learner? Or perhaps do they have both? And the student may or may not need an IEP. These issues are different, and the candidates need to know how to distinguish between the differences. And the student in the K-12 classroom may have a language development need, but they may not need that IEP. This is not just a piece that the candidate can do, again, in a one-time setting. They need to be able to use all of their assessments to inform their decisions and how they're going to assist their students in the classroom in a thoughtful manner and understand the language concerns of an EL learner and measure that to understand their developmental needs. Element 7, when they find that specialist to work with they can help them also in interpreting that English language learner's data to identify that true level of proficiency for English. Perhaps they can do fine, this English learner can do fine in a primary language, and the candidate needs to understand that in the primary language, this EL learner has it down pat, all information about science, but because they're struggling with their English language, it may be difficult for them to express that, but with SADAI techniques, the candidate needs to be able to understand that they can still teach in that classroom and help that student move forward. In element 8, in using the assessment data, it will include all the information, of course, if there are IEPs, 504 plans, etc., help establish the learning goals, and then be able to differentiate and make accommodations. And this is important for the candidate to work with those EL learners to help them in the classroom, and all students in the classroom must be able to learn, and they must be identified and help understand their learning needs. And this, as you look at this standard, it requires that the candidates be able to truly look at this and say how they learn, how to support all the students. The law says they really must be prepared in this area to be able to address the needs of all candidates, all students. Next slide, Erin.
So moving to TPE 6, Developing as a Professional Educator. This TPE, the majority of these elements will most likely be assessed only by the program. Some of this will appear, we should be on slide 19 now. Some of this could be assessed by the TPA, but only certain components of it. So the reflective practitioner. The teacher must be able to reflect on their practice. This is something that has really increased and is happening a lot more, partly because of the TPA, because we know the TPAs do cause teachers, candidates to need to reflect. The second element here, own biases, understanding your biases, implicit and explicit, understanding that they have an impact on you and how you interact in the world, and to look to mitigate negative impacts. You'll notice this doesn't say to overcome biases. It says mitigate negative impacts on biases, and to have a positive disposition. And this is something where we're asking teachers, the candidates, to have positive dispositions towards all students, all families, colleagues, and learning. And this really raises the bar, I think, for the profession in California, that this says this is what it means to be an educator. Elements 3 and 4 are verbatim on the slide. There's nothing that's been excerpted out, but they really look at, you need to have professional learning goals, and you need to continue to learn as an educator in number 6, and number 3, and in number 4, you're part of a community. It's no longer at all the case where you get your keys, you go in your room, you shut the door, and you're alone. You need to be able to work in the community of other educators, parents, community members, community at large. And so this is really explicitly written out here. Next slide. Professional responsibilities for all aspects of student learning. And you're hearing things that these things are being repeated, the concepts, because we know teaching is a very complex activity. And so there's responsibility for students here, but it's not just academic achievement, privacy issues, health, safety in the broadest sense, mental health, trauma. Professional responsibility for all aspects of student learning and classroom management. That's a really tall order. So really helping candidates dissect this and understand that this applies to you as an educator from right when you start your program throughout your entire career. The 6th and 7th elements are verbatim on the slide. The program must provide both the opportunity to learn and the opportunity to practice these TPEs, and then they must also make sure that they assess these TPEs. And there will be a program review process that we'll be talking about a little bit more, but you will be asked to show us where you teach, where you give candidates the opportunity to practice, and where you then assess each of these elements and each of the next 3 components in section 2 that we're going to talk about. So Amy, can we move to the next slide and talk about development appropriate pedagogy?
Yeah. Great, thanks, Terry. So now we're moving out of the TPE elements and narratives into the second section of the document. And in this document where it addresses subject-specific pedagogical knowledge, we again use the strategy of having some contextual paragraphs up front to be sure that these concepts, such as developmentally appropriate practice, is taken into account across all subject matter, whether you're a multiple subject teacher or you're any one of our single subject type teachers or you're an education specialist. So in this paragraph, the language points out that beginning teachers need to understand that student development varies across and within age range, and that all kinds of factors like social, cultural, linguistic, and the context in which they're learning can impact learning in complex ways. And to understand that students' learning and development is influenced by the interaction between their prior experiences, what they're bringing with them into the classroom, into the school, their ethnic background, cultural and linguistic, has to be taken into account to be able to develop the most appropriate and relevant instruction for students. What else? And the range of environmental and cultural experiences, right? So all of this needs to be taken into account as we think about subject matter, as we think about instructional planning, as we think about assessment. Beginning teachers approach classroom practice with the belief that all students can learn, and we can't emphasize that enough. Between their social emotional development and their academic development, every teacher needs to believe that every student can learn and to come in with that mental mindset, with that disposition. So that is really what this developmentally appropriate notion is speaking to. So I'm going to turn it over to Katie, who's going to talk about EL development.
Thank you, Amy. In this slide, we are looking at the comprehensive instruction for all students. And I know you've heard this theme, as Terry said, throughout, but it is such an important component. The TPEs focus on all students, whether it's the first students whose first language is English, an English learner, or the standard English learner. It's all students. As Amy pointed out earlier, this is meant to address this whole range of students served in the California public schools. But when you think about the students, if you think of it as a Venn diagram, it's kind of going to overlap with the English language learners and the variety of learners that you're going to have in your classroom. For example, if you have a student that has come in from an African-American neighborhood who uses a vernacular of English but is not speaking a standard English language, it doesn't mean that they're less intelligent because they're not speaking standard English. All students must be learners, must be looked at as having that opportunity and ability to learn. And in a least restrictive environment in the general ed classroom. And the candidates need to understand that they need to work to not over-identify with IEPs. Students should still be allowed to be in that gen ed classroom and learn in a least restrictive environment. And this should be considered, especially with the EL students, so that they look at them as learners that can make this leap into understanding and growth in their reading, writing, listening, and speaking across all domains. Now, the beginning teacher needs to be familiar with the English language development and how to imply those instructional strategies to assist all students. An overarching goal for this then would lead all students, no matter where they stand or where they began in that range of learning, to academic literacy in English in their content areas. Next slide.
Okay, moving to the slide on subject-specific pedagogical skills. This takes us to the long section of the TPEs where there are the sections for the multiple subject candidate and a section for each category for single subject candidates. The commission did have a conversation at their June meeting, and they have defined that these TPEs will define the common trunk of preparation. So education specialists will also be required to meet these TPEs, although we don't know what else they'll be required to meet yet. We have a call out for work group members on that. But teaching a discipline is interdisciplinary, so we really want them the candidates to understand that you have to collaborate with colleagues within your curricular area and across curricular areas. Also, you have to collaborate up and down the grade levels for the continuity, and the concept that English language and literacy development is a responsibility of all educators. So it's not just the multiple subject teacher and the English teacher who is responsible for literacy, reading, writing, listening, and speaking. Very important idea there. Moving to the next slide. We said we've got a lot of technical assistance coming up. This is just a placeholder slide to let you know. We will have a webcast on the standards, and what we're actually going to do is ask people to watch this webcast also, because we're not going to do in-depth on the TPEs during the webcast for the standards. We'll do some regional meetings. We'll be getting those dates out very soon. We'll be doing program review, technical assistance, and Amy and Wayne and Katie will also be doing TPA, piloting, field testing, orientation information on that. So a lot of technical assistance is planned in the near future. Please watch your PSDE news. The next slide. I know there's a lot of interest in how will programs be monitored, what is going to happen, and nobody is very sad, I think, to hear that there is no more program assessment. Program assessment is done. It's now going to be called program review, and it's fairly simple. We're going to be having meetings to help really explain the process, but you're going to have to develop an alignment matrix that shows and links to course syllabi and faculty vita that talks about where is the concepts taught, where are they practiced, where are they assessed. And you'll notice it says the TPE elements and section 2. So there's the 46 or 47 elements. Amy knows the number. I lose track. And there's the 3 big parts of section 2 of the TPEs. All of that has to be in the alignment matrix. The accreditation team members who are reviewing your institution will review TPA scores, your completer surveys, all materials that you submit in program review. They'll be looking at how the TPA is embedded in your program and how candidates are getting support and guidance. And then the very bottom idea on this slide. It's really important that every institution have at least one active member in the BIR. That's just a plug because we need that for the system to work. Next slide, and Amy, how do you get more information?
So for more information about the TPEs, we would like to invite you to get in touch with Katie or myself, and you can see our email addresses there. There's for TPA redevelopment, you can get in touch with me. For the Cal TPA, the current approved TPAs that are still being implemented for one more year, you can talk to Wayne Baser or to me. And then for the preliminary multiple subject, single subject program standards, we would like to invite you to get in touch with Katie Croy. All of us really have an understanding, obviously, of all of this, but these are your main contacts.
So this pretty much concludes the presentation. If we wanted to give the information to you. So Christian, next